Welcome. Today, guys, we are going to be doing some brakes on a 2008 Yukon XL Denali. These brakes have suffered from some warped rotors and some loud brake squeals. So we went down to our local Napa, got hooked up with some front and rear pads, rotors, some brake clean, and we're going to get this swapped out today. Alright, so step one getting these brakes done is we're going to start on the front axle. We're doing both. It doesn't matter what axle you start on, but we're going to start on the front today. We're going to go ahead and get the wheels jacked up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jack up this side, put my jack stand underneath, go around, jack up the other side, and set my jack stand on that side so both front wheels are off the ground. You should always put a wheel chock on the back tire since it's going to be on the ground, just to prevent this from rolling. I'm not concerned about this particular vehicle because it's all-wheel drive and basically it can't go anywhere because it's all-wheel drive as long as there's a tire on the ground. So given that, we're going to go ahead and get it jacked up, get the tires off, and take a look at the brakes. Alright, so we got the front tires off. We're now going to be looking at our brakes. Looks like somebody maybe has pulled this rotor off the car before and turned it. And if they pull them off the car, doing multiples at a time, they'll usually label them right to left, or maybe somebody went to a junkyard and put junkyard rotors on it. I really don't know. The rotors themselves, you know, as far as rust, there really isn't a rust issue on these particular rotors. A lot of times this will be like rusting apart, and the rust will be down here into the surface area where the pad's right at. But this isn't too bad. The main issue we have is brake pulsation and brake squeal, and so we determined we were just going to go ahead and replace the pads and the rotors all the way around. Maybe I could have mic'd these rotors and possibly turned them again, but we determined, we'll just put new stuff on for peace of mind to be easier. But what I'm going to go ahead and start off by doing is getting this caliper compressed. That way I can remove the caliper. And when I mean compress, I'm actually just going to start it off just a little bit, because if I unbolted this caliper the way it sits right now and attempted to lift it off, it would not want to come off very easy. And actually, I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and show you that real quick. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and I'll show you what I was talking about how it's hard to just pull the caliper off right off the bat if you don't compress in the caliper piston just a little bit. So I've got a 19 millimeter. This one's a gear wrench. You can use a ratchet and a socket. It really doesn't matter. This is just the first thing that came to my hand here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to undo the lower bolt here. So depending on how tight this is, I may make a fool out of myself. There we go. Actually not too bad. So I'm going to go ahead and remove it. Just a 19 millimeter. If you don't have millimeter, 3/4 inch wrench will get the job done just the same. So I remove that. And if you see, okay, well, a little bit of a liar in this case. Usually there's little nubs on the back of these pads. This one doesn't have any that are blocking it. And those nubs will prevent it from wanting to flip up. But in this case, on this set of pads, that is not the case. So, yeah, if you see these brake pads, they're actually not bad. These would be, if you ever go get your oil changed, these would measure way in the green still. Kind of ashamed to replace them, but the only thing I don't know is I don't know what the pads are, what they're made out of. If they're ceramic, semi-metallic. What I can tell you is they make a heck of a lot of noise, and for that reason we're going to put a new set of pads on that I've had a lot of experience with in the past that I know to be pretty quiet. So we'll go ahead and head on to the next step. Alright, so basically what I just did, obviously the pads are still out, but this is what I did when I was doing this for a living. Make this go by quicker. A lot of people would remove both bolts, and as long as this upper slide pin is not seized, which you'd know right away because you wouldn't be able to lift this up, you only need to undo the lower bolt. You don't need to undo the upper bolt in this case. So now you've lifted it up. The one trick I was going to show you, and actually let me just do that real quick, that way you got all the information, because I don't know what your vehicle is going to encounter, whether you're going to have rust issues or a different brand of pads. But this would be set on here like this. I always say you can take a flathead screwdriver. This is just a small little pry bar tool. And what you're going to do is you're going to come in through these holes, and you're just going to find either the rotor or the other side of the pad to hook onto. And you're just going to give it just a little bit of a push. And what I've done is I've actually compressed these caliper pistons in a little bit. If you don't have a compressor tool to push these in after the fact, you can actually go ahead and compress the entire caliper that way. Matter of fact, I might go ahead and do that. And basically you just kind of adjust your grip, give it a good tighten, kind of give it a good pull. And what you've done now, you can see is we've set these caliper pistons further back in. So if you don't have the proper tool, sometimes you can get around it. I used to do that all the time, doing this for a living back in the day. So simple as that. For this upper caliper, this is why you don't need to remove the upper bolt. It'll just slide right out, slide pin. There's no need to undo that upper bolt. You just kind of waste time. Not saying it matters, but when you're doing this for a living and you're trying to get them in and out, but still do the job properly, that's a nice quick little tip to save you about 30 seconds worth of time. But from there, we're going to go ahead. We've got 2 more bolts holding the caliper bracket on. They're going to be, I believe, an 18 millimeter. It's going to be an 18 millimeter. So I'm going to get an 18 millimeter on a ratchet because this is going to have quite a bit of torque on them because they typically have Loctite on them to keep them from coming loose. So I'll need a little bit more torque to get these out. So I'm going to go grab an 18 millimeter socket, ratchet with an extendable handle or an extension, and get these bolts loose. She was on there. Might stand up for this one. Oh yeah. Definitely got Loctite on them, which is proper. They should have Loctite on them. Alright, so I was talking to you guys about the Loctite. I don't know, hopefully that'll focus. You see all that buildup on the bolt? That is red Loctite, which is like the death Loctite. You're supposed to only be able to remove that with heat. Whenever I did this, I would always go back with blue Loctite because blue Loctite will hold them in just fine, but it makes it easier to remove them when you actually want to remove them. But that's the Loctite I was telling you about that holds them in pretty good. If you have an air impact or electric impact, it'd probably do just fine if you get in there good. Honestly, I didn't, just because I don't know why. I definitely could have, but went and did it the old hard way. So now you know what to look out for. Kind of a way you can tell if it's Loctite is it almost feels like maybe they're cross-threaded because the whole way out they have resistance as you're turning them. But no, that's just part of the Loctite being on there. So usually what you'll do is you'll take a wire wheel, if you have one, or a wire brush, and try to get that crud out. If you're doing this at home in your driveway, I just reinstall them and not worry about it. They'll go in just fine. They'll thread back in just like they were. So not too big a deal. Where you're seeing that buildup, that's actually where it was going through the caliper bracket, and that's why it's not into the threads. But yeah, that's all there is to that. Just know that these are going to be in there pretty tight. That's probably going to be one of the hardest parts of the whole job, is getting these bolts out if you don't have the right tools. I use a 12-point socket. A 6-point socket would be best, or something that grips them a little tighter. It works. So you don't have to have all those fancy tools in order to do this job. This is a simple driveway job, so not a big deal. All right, so the last step to getting this side completely disassembled is actually going to be removing this Torx screw right here. So the Torx bit is kind of a love-hate relationship. What I mean by that is, I hate it. and the fact that they love to strip. A Torx head socket is something that you as a guy in the driveway may not even have. I will let you know on this particular application, this Torx head socket does not, I say socket, it's not a Torx head socket. It's a Torx headed screw. I apologize. This Torx headed screw does not need to be here. The reason this screw is on here is for when this truck is rolling down the assembly line, they install the rotor. They want a way of holding the rotor flat up against the hub. Otherwise, this rotor would sit cockeyed, and it might make it more difficult as they go down the assembly line. Setting the rest of the brake components on is my guess. It just makes it go faster for them. If you don't have a Torx head, sometimes you can try to jam a 6-point hex head in there. I've not had great luck with it. What I do know is that these are actually pretty soft. And what I mean by that is you can easily drill the head of these off. And when you drill the head of them off, you can usually pound the rotor, and this rotor will come free. And then you can get some vice grips or something like that, and you can remove the rest of the stud that's left. So know that if you're stuck at home and you don't have a Torx head, but you do have a drill and drill bits, just drill the center of that out, and that head will pop off, and just remove the rotor. Don't worry about it. It doesn't have to be there. This is no longer down the assembly line. Going back together with it, if you need to hold the rotor tight to make it easier, take a lug nut, flip it backwards, screw it back on, and hold the rotor up just fine. So sometimes usually come in, they'll be so rusted out, there's nothing you can do. I wouldn't even think twice when I was doing this for a living. I would drill that sucker right off and keep on rolling with my day. So don't get hung up over dumb little things like that. That does not need to be there. I always found it easier to remove them with the impact. Just give them an initial shock. Always seem to get them free, whereas if I tried to use a ratchet, a lot of times they would strip out. So just like that, that's all the screw is. It's a little T30. I'll mention that. It's a T30 hex Torx headed screw. Now you can look back at my rotor. This one has obviously been off before. My guess is this wheel bearing has been replaced based off of how clean the surface is. And I don't believe the GM ones have that written on them, so I'm almost positive this wheel bearing has been replaced before, so this rotor's been off. And you see it really does not suffer from any sort of rust issues. So given that, I think it popped off real easy. I didn't even need to tap it with the hammer. If you live up in the northern climate where they use road salt, I doubt you're going to get that lucky, so I apologize. But that's just how it goes here in Wyoming. We don't use road salt, so even though we do get a lot of snow, we just deal with it, and in turn our vehicles last a lot longer. So other than that, I don't know if this will show up on camera, Josh. If you can get in, can you see the discoloration on the rotor? Where I got like a really darker inner ring here, and then an outer ring that's not as dark. That definitely tells me we've got some uneven pad wear up against the face of this rotor, where that inside is getting probably a little hotter than the outside. So just something to look at, and it probably explains why I have warped rotors so bad when you can visually see it like that. I don't have a brake lathe personally, but when I used to turn rotors and they look like that, you'd get some really weird patterns as you were slowly trimming the rotor back. So we're obviously going to go ahead and put a new one on and call it good. So we'll go ahead and start getting the new stuff pulled out. All right, so we are at my pile of parts. I've got some rotors, 4 rotors, 2 sets of pads. We'll go ahead and zoom in. I'll show you what comes in. Obviously, I always recommend, just as a rule of thumb, 1 can of brake clean per axle. So if I'm doing front brakes, I want 1 can of brake clean. If I'm doing front and rear brakes, I want 2 cans of brake clean. Just kind of an easy rule of thumb. And that's how we'd always bill it out whenever I was quoting a job when I was working on cars for a living. So makes it really easy. We've got some Napa premium brake pads. This would be their SS lineup, and I say that because that's how they're labeled. They used to be called safety stops back in the day, I believe, and so nowadays they went back and they simplified the names of their lineups. So you got premium, ultra premium, and then they have ultra premium is going to be in a gray box similar to these rotors, and then there's their low end line, which I believe are called true stops. They're in a green box. I don't necessarily recommend them unless you're on a budget. I do recommend, these are just fine. I've installed hundreds and hundreds of these sets of pads and had very few issues. I mean, not to say that they were all perfect, but I had very few issues with them. When you open up the box, here we greeted to a nice shiny new set of pads. They also, what I like these, is they make sure you get fresh hardware. And what'll happen is on your old ones, these will get rusted up so bad your brake pads can't slide back and forth like they need to, which will cause the pad to wear out prematurely. So pads, if you're going Napa, which I always had great luck with, get the premium line of pads or higher. So they've got premium, they have ultra premium, and then they have a line called adaptive ones, or we always call them ADOs. They were adaptive ones that are kind of a little bit of a specialty. They're right basically on the same price point as the ultra premiums typically, and we ran those quite a bit and had good luck. A set of these pads, I mean, they're going to be $50 or less typically. Ultra premiums are going to be from 50 to 100 probably. Especially if you got a Yukon Denali or something like that. If you got the money, go with a little better product. Then we've got the pads. I'm now looking at the brake rotors. Now, these are the ultra premium brake rotors, and the only reason why I have ultra premium brake rotors here is simply because that's what they had in stock for this vehicle. Kind of surprising because these 2007 to 14 Tahoe, Suburban, Yukon XLs, they run the same brakes, and so there's a million of them, at least here in Wyoming, so it's kind of weird that they were out, but I guess because there's so many people are going to knock them out this weekend like I'm doing. So we end up getting the ultra premium rotors. Nothing wrong with that. It's a better rotor as far as they got coatings and things like that on them. Just know that typically if I'm doing my own vehicle, I'm not doing any sort of performance. I don't know that you're going to get the extra money's worth out of the ultra premium rotor. Now they might have a better warranty on them, which to you that might be worth more. Me being mechanically inclined, if I got to throw a set of rotors on a brake lathe, I have access to one still. I can go do that, so I don't worry about it too much if I need to turn a set. But for you, if you got the warranties matter, pay the extra money, go ahead. But on the ultra premiums, they are nice. I would give them that. Nothing against them. Just I've always had great luck running just the premium Napa rotors. That's almost exclusively what I'd install. I've had issues with almost all the other parts houses with work rotors right out of the box, and I really didn't have that issue with Napa. And anytime I did have an issue, not saying the other ones wouldn't have worked with us, but this is on a professional level when I worked in the shop. Napa actually paid us labor to resurface their rotors on the car, which I think was kind of nice. So if there ever was an issue, our rep Mark, he just didn't care. He said, get it handled, take care of the customer, and we'll reimburse you. So that's kind of why I always like buying the Napa parts. If I'm doing brake parts for sure. Just had a good working relationship with Napa here in town. So ultra premium rotor comes. It's a coated rotor. See what they say. 100% polymer coated, corrosion resistant. So if you live in a high corrosion environment, see obviously you've already seen my previous rotor where I really don't have a rust issue. The coating isn't as big a deal to me, but if you got like a high-end car and you want it to look nice, this coating will wear off on the areas that the pads ride, but every other area where the pads don't ride, it likes to keep that coating on there, which will prevent rust from wanting to build up on them. It's not the end-all be-all. They will still rust. Give it time. That's just how it works. But they will stay nicer longer. So if that's something that you're interested in, go with the coated rotors. I see a lot of these types of rotors for sale online off like eBay and Amazon and packages. I'll be honest, I don't have any experience with them, so I can't tell you if they're good or bad. But this rotor needs to be in good shape. Looks nice. We got to get it pulled out of the bag and get it installed. So before we officially install the rotor on the car, I always take them and flip them, set them on the hub backwards. And the reason why this rotor doesn't seem to have it because it's coated, it doesn't need it. But if you get a normal rotor, they're covered in what we call cosmoline, which is basically a rust inhibitor that they put on the rotors because they're steel or iron, and they will rust in the box if they don't. And you'll get a lot of this weird goop, brown goo looking stuff just kind of on the face of the rotor. You don't want to just put that up against your brand new brake pads because that stuff will actually get trapped in the pad and will cause it to, you'll get weird. You'll stop afterwards and your brakes will be smoking. You think you messed up the job. You just didn't clean the rotor properly. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you what that looks like. I always stick them on the rotor backwards. And then I'm just going to take my brake clean, hit the face of the rotor, I hit the insides, and I also spray through these vanes because the cosmoline's in there. And again, if you don't get it all off, what happens is when it warms up, it burns off, which is fine. It goes away completely once it burns off. The issue is that your brakes are smoking, and when you do this as a shop, people get pretty upset when they leave. They barely make it to their house, they get out, and their brakes are smoking. They think you did something wrong. When in reality, it's just a cosmoline burning off. And so I always made it a principle to make sure that I not only got the surface that the pad's right on, but try to spray off all these surfaces around it as well, just to prevent that from happening. So once I get the outside, you don't really want to leave your oils on these rotors, which is why you're cleaning them off as well, to make sure anything you touch doesn't get absorbed into the rotor and the pad. But take 2 rags, 1 rag, cut it in half. You're just going to take your rotor, flip it around, line her back up. Just like that. We're now on the front side. So we can clean the front side off. Make sure we get all of our finger oils and things like that off the rotor. I will say, I typically don't splurge for the ultra premium rotors, but it does look damn nice on this car. So, you know, might be something I do more often from here on out. I do like the look. Now this is where, if you can see, this rotor isn't sitting solid on the hub, which is fine. This is where you could go back with that Torx headed screw, or you can do something else that I'm going to show you here. I'm going to grab a lug nut. On this style lug nut, it's just a standard acorn style. The other one, the older style, they're a little longer and they have threaded portion for their hubcaps. Either way, you're going to take and thread it on backwards, where the flat side, not the acorn side, is going up against the rotor. Just thread it on backwards like that. Just hand tight, don't get it tight. You want to be able to pull it off easy, but guess what? The rotor's now on there, and I didn't even put that screw back in. You don't have to put the screw back in. There's no need for it in this case. So if you want to, if you got it, and you say, you know what, screw it, I want to put the screw back in, do it. I'm not saying don't. But if you have to drill yours out, don't go try buying a new one. Not a problem. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next step. We've got the rotor on the car. What I'm going to go ahead and do now is I'm going to take care of the caliper bracket, make sure it's in good shape and is ready to go, re-lubricate my slide pins, things like that. So what I'm going to do is start off with, real simple, we're going to just pop the old brake hardware off. 2 clips, 1 on each side. If you get the premium pads or higher with the Napa, I know for a fact they come with the hardware. The cheaper ones may not, and they want you to use the old hardware. But I've got, so this is technically a different style clip. These had kind of a pushback spreader. The new ones is going to clip on the inside. We're going to see if I don't think it's going to work well. I'll clean these ones up and go back to the old ones. And this is just there's probably an update where maybe this was like the original and this was the updated version, and that's how you end up with 2 different sizes. So it's going to be pretty simple. Just going to make sure underneath these, if you live in a rusty environment, rust will build up under here where these clips sit at. If there's rust there, clean them off, because what will happen is it will actually cause these to sit up higher, which decreases the gap that the pads have to sit in, which causes the pads to want to bind up, which causes the pads to wear out prematurely, get a lot of weird brake issues because of it. So it's real important you make sure that's clean, especially on this step, because this is important to make sure your pads live a long, healthy life. You know, and this is on top of like driving habits. Obviously, you can make your brakes last longer or shorter depending on how you drive. But this is kind of if you're doing the job right, make sure these things are clean, and you'll be good to go. So I'm gonna go ahead and push this hardware on. No, I'm not. If you see it kind of rattling around, doesn't really fit very well. Well, that's because just adjust these clips a little tighter outward. Don't go too much. And now that ain't gonna come falling off of there. And just because of the way that they package them, they all sit in this bag in the box, and they've been shipped over from whatever they're manufactured to you. They kind of get spread out a little bit. They can get a little twisted up in the bag. So I'm just gonna do the same to the other side. Got a nice good click on there. Looks good. And then move on to the next step. Now I've got new hardware on there. Slide pin. See how the slide pin has a lot of kind of dirty grease. Now this slide pin is still lubricated. This happens. You can put clear grease, any color grease on there. This is what it looks like after it gets heated up for a while. So the fact that the grease is still there is what I look for. It tells me that, hey, it was greased properly. At least, you know, that was done correctly. But grease does break down and wear out, especially when you think your brakes are going to be several hundred degrees over and over and over and over and over again. So I just take my rag, I'm going to wipe this off, get it back down to bare metal, make sure there's no crazy wear patterns, like if it had ever gone without grease and got rusted up, something like that, pitted. These kits to replace these are not expensive. You should do that at that time if that's the case. But these ones look fine. I'm going to go ahead. This is synthetic moly brake lubricant. I do like the synthetic brake lubricant because it's usually really high temp, which is good because brakes get really high temperature. So I am going to go ahead, and this is like the type of stuff that you'd be able to buy from the auto parts store when you're buying the pads. Usually they're going to say, hey, do you want some brake grease? Get some. I actually find myself using quite a bit. So don't get one pack, you know, minimum 1 pack per axle. You can get the job done. I usually use 2 myself. Now, a little easier for me because I actually have a stash of these from when I used to do brakes for a living, because we'd actually buy brakes, grease in a tube from Napa, and so I wouldn't use these. Some of the pads would come with these. I wouldn't actually use these there because I just had a tube of it, so I'd always keep these and stash these. So I still have a supply of these hanging around. But this is the same stuff you go to the store to buy, so nothing special here. Just going to open it up. Might be a little messy. This stuff being a moly grease, it's already basically kind of like a graphite color, kind of that dark gray. Just going to push some out. Use my finger. Smear it around all sides and the end. This grease not only is helping to keep it lubricated, it's also going to help keep moisture out. Moisture is what causes them to rust up. So it is important you get a healthy layer. You don't want to overdo it because you'll actually bind it up. You know, there's kind of a lot of steps, but it's really not hard. Lubricate these pins real well. I lubricate them all the way up to the point where they sit into this rubber boot. If that old grease looks really gross and dirty, what I would do is I'd take my brake clean and my strop, I'd hold this over a trash can, and I'd spray up in that chamber and let it rinse out. The old grease didn't look too bad, so I'm not going to worry about it. It was still, these were moving real nice and smooth. So I'm just going to simply put this back in. I was kind of twist them when I put them back in, make sure that fresh grease is distributed evenly. I'm going to pop it back in. Let me get a little closer here, Josh. Into this rubber boot. That rubber boot is what's going to keep dirt and moisture from also getting in there. So what you want to do is you want to check these, make sure they're not torn. These ones actually seem to be in good shape still, so that's why I want to reuse them. If they were torn, Napa sells the kit. You can simply pop these old ones out. You can pop new ones in. Not a big deal. So as far as it goes, the way this caliper bracket is set up, we got new hardware. I've lubricated the 1 pin that's in the bracket. I'm going to go ahead and mount this back on the vehicle, and then I will lubricate the 2nd pin that's on the caliper, and we'll go about that business. Go ahead and reinstall our caliper bracket. You take your bolts that you previously removed. This is where you'd apply your fresh Loctite onto the bolt if you have it. Otherwise, they'll be fine. As long as you torque them down, get them good and tight, you're not going to have issues. It's just kind of when you work for a shop, you have to do what we call a cover your ass. And basically, if you're Loctiting them in and that's just company policy, then there's no way that one could come out. And if it does come out, it's easy for the company to then go back and be like, hey, you didn't follow protocol. And it kind of gives them a fail-safe as far as like, no, this is our policy, this is how we do it, so these issues don't happen. If you're doing this in your driveway, you're just doing one car, you're not likely to get super complacent like you would when you're doing your 10th car that day. Therefore, your attention to detail will be greater on each car. Therefore, these issues are likely not to happen. So just know that you should Loctite it in a perfect world. We're going to go ahead. I always just get them started. Threading them on by hand to the point where they don't want to thread on by hand no more. Alright, grab the old ratchet, and we're going to tighten them up. You know, if you're using like an air impact, just get them tight. If you're using air impact, you probably kind of got a good feeling for it. Just get them good and tight. It's a really big bolt. If you snap them, you're doing something incredibly wrong. If you saw how thick the threads were, the thickness of that bolt. So just get them tight. I know, based off experience, that's not going to fail. That's not going to come loose. So I'm good to go there. Now, before I go any further, the one thing I do want to check, and you'll run into this sometimes with this aftermarket hardware, is if it doesn't sit perfectly center, there's a very, very thin area on either side of the rotor up in here. And if this hardware is shifted one way or the other, it'll rub on the rotor. When you go to drive, all you hear is you'll hear that metal on metal grinding noise. You think you're royally screwed up and you're in a big panic. I can tell you how many times I fixed jobs that were done in the driveway that they thought they did something royally wrong, and all it was the hardware was just lightly shifted over and rubbing on the rotor. So no, everything else was right, just you didn't center up the clips good enough or whatever it was. And so definitely just take the time, do that right. You'll save yourself a lot of headache in the end. But we're going to go ahead and wipe the grease off of this pin here. Just get everything kind of ready to go. I may need to compress those pistons in a little more. I didn't try too hard when I was doing it earlier because I know I have a piston compressor. If you're using my pry bar method, you just need to make sure these pistons are basically flush in with the caliper. I'm going to take my grease. Get this looking good. And so I'm coming up on the bottom half of one packet of this, and that's why I say I like to get 2 per axle. Because I'd rather overdo this and underdo it, but you still don't want to overdo it too much. I know it's kind of complex, but alright, so I'm going to finish real quick. I'm going to grab my caliper compressor tool. I'm going to finish pushing that in, and then I'll show you the next step. So next step, we're going to grab our new brake pads. So you'll notice on these is they're actually 2 different style brake pads. And what I mean is the backing plate, the way that this doesn't have that kind of arch cut out. And there actually is specific side to side on this. The outer one does not have any sort of brake squeal indicator on them, but the inboard pad does. And that's what that piece is right there. That actually sticks through the pad. And when the pad wears down thin enough, that actually starts scraping against the rotor, which gives you that loud, obnoxious brake screech. Now, when you're looking at your new pads, you're going to have 2 outer pads that are going to be identical. It does not matter which one you use, on which side. Outer pad does not matter. So I'm going to take the one pad, set it off to the side. Now what you are going to find is when it comes to your inner pad, there is a difference, and that is what side of the pad the indicator is on. Now, rule of thumb is the indicator should always face the bottom when it is installed on the rotor in the caliper bracket. So, in the way that this one is mounted, this is how it would sit on the car, up against, indicator facing the bottom of the rotor. I don't know why, but brake pads always tend to taper off towards the bottom and they wear funky. Not always, but almost always they taper towards the bottom. And that's why I always make sure my indicator is pointing towards the bottom. So therefore, I need to make sure I get the right pad to make that match. So this was installed correctly before. I get a lot that I find that, I say installed correctly. It works either way. It's just that's the way they're designed. Is that indicator is pointing down. So on this particular setup, that's the difference. So I've got my new pads, my inner and my outer. A little bit of dust on them. What we're going to do next is I'm going to take that brake lubricant that I have, and I'm going to smear it just on these feet right here. I don't want to get it on the pads. You don't want any sort of lubricant on these pads ever whatsoever. So we're going to lubricate the ears of these pads here. And the reason why is because I want these to be able to slide smoothly in the caliper bracket so they don't get hung up and they don't wear funny. So that's one of those things that a lot of times if guys are just slapping pads in the driveway, they forget that step. If you've got the brake grease, you got the pins, lubricate the pads. It's a simple step, and it does help make them last a little longer. All right. One last step that I like to do before I slap this all together. Using your brake lubricant, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to apply this brake lubricant to the caliper. And just a couple key spots on the caliper. Anywhere the caliper touches the brake pads. This has nothing to do about lubricating anything in this particular instance. This is actually about noise, vibration, isolation. Brake noises. When you hear brake noise, all that is it's actually high frequency vibrations that are causing that noise. A thin layer of grease anywhere the caliper touches the pads, the back of the pads. So on the caliper pistons, we're going to put a layer of grease. And then there's these three little ears on this particular vehicle. We're going to put grease on these ears as well. And all this is for is this gives you a layer of isolation between the caliper and the pads, which will help absorb vibrations, which will in turn make your brake job quieter. Therefore, it took me all of 20 seconds to knock that out. I have just used basically every last drop out of this one brake lube packet. And it got the job done. We got both pins, I got the pads, and the caliper all lubricated. So now, the same way I took this caliper off, I'm going to put it back on. I'm going to lift the caliper up. I'm going to slide it, ensuring that the rubber piece seats fully. And I'm going to slide this over my pads. Then all I got to do is reinstall the bolts. Tighten it up. There is Torx specs to these, but when you do enough of them, you just get a good feel for it. I honestly haven't used Torx specs on these in a very long time. Get them tight. That's all I gotta say. Get them tight. You can look up the Torx spec to get an idea, but if you get them tight, they're not coming off. We have now done one side completely. It is good to go. I'm going to repeat this process on the other side, and then that will conclude the front brake job. And then we will put the wheels on and we'll actually start on the rear. So I will pick back up once we are doing the rear brake job. We got the fronts all wrapped up, wheels are back on. We've got the rear wheels off. ready to tackle the rear brakes here. A lot of the same principles are going to match basically as to how I handle this job. So I'm going to go ahead and start off by removing the lower caliper bolt. I should be able to swing the caliper up, push it out just like I did on the front, and go about it that way. So let's go ahead and get started. Just so you guys are aware, this is these are 13 millimeter. So you'll just need a 13 millimeter, and then it'll be the same 18 millimeter lower caliper bolts. These also had like a Loctite on them as well, real common. So now, let's see if it'll cooperate. All right, this lifts up. And we're gonna just walk that off. We set the caliper up, top there. You'll see on some videos where they'll either just leave them hanging or they'll tie them up with something. If I'm just doing one at a time, I'm not really too worried about this falling over. I'll just set them up on top of something. Not a big deal. Now, here I have a good example of brakes that are due to be replaced. The rear. The fronts were actually in really good shape still, besides the pulsation. I don't know if you can see this, but the pad material real darn close, which is honestly probably most of our noise is coming from back here. But basically completely wore out there. Now, all of these, from 07 to 14, I can confirm the Tahoes, Suburbans, Yukon XLs, right rear, which is the side we're on, inboard pad wears the hardest. You will go through 2 to 3 sets of rear brakes before you wear out the fronts. I don't know why. I don't know if it has to do with the way that they proportion the brakes or what. That is what I found. These right rear inboards will always wear faster, and that is the exact pad that is almost completely worn down to nothing. So we actually caught this at a great time to get these brakes swapped out. So other than that, we're now stuck with basically what we had before. I've got 2 18 millimeter caliper bracket bolts that need to come off, just like on the other one. They're just on the inside here. You can't really see it good with the camera, but understand that it's basically exactly the same. I'm going to have to get a good grip on this to pull these loose. You really can't get an impact in on these rear ones due to the axle and everything being in the way. So we're probably going to kind of get underneath it a little bit and get it pulled down and get these broke loose. And we'll be right back. So we got the caliper bracket off. We got those bolts loose. I'm going to set the bracket down. Next I'm going to try to pull the rotor off. Fortunately we're not rusty, so it comes right off. Now the inside of this rotor is a little special. If you've never been inside of one of these, you actually have a drum brake surface inside of your disc brake rotor, which that's how the parking brake works. There's a parking brake shoe right here. And when you apply the parking brake, it spreads that shoe out, which holds against that drum, which is supposed to stop your car from rolling. These GM parking brake setup, notoriously terrible. If you live in a rusty climate, the parking brake cables are probably seized or snapped. These shoes come ripped off all the time. A lot of them don't work very well. That being said, I live in a pretty good climate. This seems to be fully functional, no issues, so we're not going to worry about the parking brake at all today. So I'm going to go ahead and swap these rotors out. From here on out, honestly, most of everything I do is exactly the way I did the fronts. I'm going to put the new rotor on. I'm going to clean it with the brake clean. I'm going to put my new hardware on the caliper bracket. I'm going to lubricate the slide pins. I'm going to lubricate the pads. I'm going to lubricate the caliper. I'm going to put it all back up together. Real simple, not a lot to it. I could show you more about it, but honestly it's just going to be mirroring what I've already done. The only thing really special on these rears is they use a 13 millimeter bolt that goes in to the caliper bracket instead of the 19 millimeter bolt that it uses up front. It uses the same 18 millimeter head bolt for the caliper bracket as it does up front. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this rear brake job, and then once we're all done, I'll talk to you guys again. And we have completed installing new brake pads and rotors, front and rear. We got the tires on. Torque the lug nuts, full-size GM trucks are 140 foot-pounds, and that basically has been a standard going back to at least the early 90s on the four-wheel drive trucks, 140 foot-pounds. So if you got a 6-lug GM vehicle, 140 foot-pounds is basically the torque spec on them. So I got those torqued down. A couple more things we need to check before we just hop in the truck and roll. One of them, when you look at the brake fluid level, I anticipate it being full due to the way that we compress the caliper pistons. We did not open bleeder valves. If I was doing a brake fluid flush, something like that, I would have opened those bleeder valves and made sure that they opened. If you live in a really rusty environment, you may not want to even chance trying to open those bleeder valves. So on a situation like this, I didn't worry about it. But we do want to come over here, if you want to follow me in, Josh, to your brake master cylinder. You should always make sure if you open it up, you're not going to get dirt and crud in there. So open it up. Basically, it's to the cap. A lot of times, what will happen is if somebody tops out the brake fluid when the brake pads are low, the pistons down at the caliper, they're expanded further out, and so they actually hold more fluid. So if you top it off with the pads low, when I go to compress it back, you'll actually overflow the master cylinder and fluid will leak out down the front of the brake booster here. What I'm going to go ahead and do is leave this off for just a second. Before you even think about driving this vehicle, you have to pump up the brake pedal. Basically right now, since I've compressed those caliper pistons, there's a gap between the brake pad and the caliper piston and the rotor. And so these are self-adjusting brakes. As you use them, they always self-adjust, so they're always at the ideal spacing. If I were to back out right now and hit the brakes to stop, I wouldn't. I would keep rolling until I can pump the pedal up enough that I get pressure. So I'm going to go ahead, and if you want to follow me around, you must always do this. Don't ever skip this step. This is the most important. I have seen what happens when you skip this step, and it ended up with bumper replacement and repairing a bedside because it smashed into a brick wall. Not even going very fast, but you don't have to be going very fast if you don't have brakes. So I'm just going to press the pedal in until the pedal gets really hard. The pedal should be rock hard. It's where it's basically, you know, it only goes in so much. And that's what I got right now. So now I know that this vehicle will stop when I go to back up, which is what you want. So, up here at the master cylinder, you see my level has dropped down a bit. It's a little above the max. That max, you know, whatever, not the end of the world. I'm going to grab some brake clean real quick, hose that off, just get it all cleaned up. Alright. Well, there we go. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to take it for a test drive. We're going to just kind of break in the brakes, break them in, get them embedded, get the pad material embedded into the rotor. It's not uncommon when you first go for a drive, you might get some squeaks and some squeals. That is entirely normal no matter what type of pad you put on, because you need the brake pad material to embed itself into the brake rotor, and then they start meshing and they get happy. And so what I'm going to go do is I'm going to do several slow stops from, basically if I'm doing say 50 mile an hour, I'm going to slow down about 30 mile an hour, just a nice gradual slow down, and I'm going to do that like 10 times. Usually if I was doing this in a shop, I had a test drive route that would basically allow me to do this, where I could get up to speed and I could slow down, get up to speed, slow down. I'm just going to do this going down my road here. As a driver, if you own the vehicle, there's definitely a lot more in-depth procedure you could do to embed the brakes and burnish the brakes. As an automotive shop, you're going to get one test drive and you're going to turn the car over to the customer. So just know that if you're a customer getting this done at a shop, you may look up the procedure, because it will help your brakes last a little longer as they embed in properly, help prevent them from getting warped early, things like that, because a warped rotor is usually caused by the brake pad embedding unevenly into the rotor, and then over time it gets worse and worse and worse and worse to the point where you're feeling it through the whole car, steering wheel shaking, things like that. So right now we've got all new rotors, all new pads, calipers have been serviced and lubricated, all new hardware. This should not have any warpage. If you do all this and you still have a weird pulsation, you could have a tire balance issue if it's at speed, or you could have a hub or a wheel flange that maybe somebody's been in a car accident in the past and something's hit that tire and they did all repairs but they didn't see that was damaged, and it's been that way ever since, things like that. So know that if you're still experiencing pulsations, it doesn't necessarily mean that what you've done is wrong. Now I have seen warped rotors right out of the box. The way to solve that concern is to take it to a shop with an on-the-car brake lathe, because they'll actually turn it true to the hub of the vehicle regardless of what that hub is doing. And I've actually had that on several vehicles where the rear axle was involved in some sort of accident in the past where it looked good when they were inspecting it. And they shipped it and they'd have this pulsation that you can never get rid of, and it was actually because the axle flange was bent. Well, okay, you can buy a new $300 axle shaft and pay me a couple $100 in labor to swap out the shaft. That's the correct repair. Or I could turn it on the car. I charged an hour's worth of labor to turn an axle on the car, so they'd pay me at the time, it was $71. I would turn those rotors to that hub flange and they would not have a pulsation issue anymore. So a lot of people liked that we could do that. It was actually really cool technology. And if you ever are taking it to a shop, you may ask if they're going to turn the rotors, or you turning them on the car, because that is the best way to go about it. But other than that, we are going to road test this thing. We're going to get those brakes broken in, burnished, and we should be good to go.